Live on YouTube, and we'll see how it goes. You're live. Okay. Well, welcome to another session of Sabbath Bible Lesson Teachers Helps. This is for the SBL lesson we're doing, Sabbath Bible Lessons, and this is lessons on the book of Mark. And so, back to front on Instagram, but go over to YouTube and Gellion, Engeeion, if you want to read it forward, left to right. Okay, but on YouTube, there you go. Lessons on the book of Mark. We're doing lesson number 8, when Jesus commanded silence. Now, just so you know, I have these lessons are designed for. Well, this video is designed for those who are teaching in the Sabbath School class. So if you're a student, you may get something out of it, but primarily this is directed towards teachers. And if you've been to my seminars around the world, you know what I'm meaning when I talk about when you go into a class, you should always have an objective in mind. What's the objective of the lesson? And you need to establish that objective before you go into class, not when you're in class. And to do that, we go through the lesson day by day and come to an understanding each day of what is the main idea. So each day there'll be a main point, and each day will have one main point, and those points will become what we call micro points. 5 micro points, and we summarize those into an overall objective for the lesson. And so a lesson is built then upon the subject matter of the day, the content of the lesson of each day. So it's the principle of macro, micro, macro. That's the macro point is the overall objective of the lesson. Micro points are those 5 points, one from each day, one from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Oh, this is the call to absolute commitment. Sorry, where are we? Where are we going to? When Jesus commanded silence. So Sunday, you'll have one, summarize that into one point, take-home point. Same with Monday, summarizing that into one take-home point. Tuesday, one take-home point. Wednesday and Thursday. So you'll have 5 take-home points, which we then summarize into an overall objective for the lesson. That objective becomes our take-home point for the week, and that's what I want my class to understand. So if you're teaching in Sabbath School, hopefully you'll get something out of this that will help you in preparing your lesson study to help your class take home what's the crucial or the main idea from the lesson study this week. Now, also remember when you're in class, not to simply ask questions straight from the lesson, like the prepared questions. I mean, they are there, and we want our students to cover those questions, but those questions are not necessarily the questions you would ask in class, because remember, or put it this way, you don't want to ask a question like this, what command did Jesus give to the unclean spirits? And then Mark 1, 23, 27, and get someone to read the Bible verse. Then you get someone to read the note, and you move on to the next question. That's not teaching the lesson. What you want to do is, sure, you might ask a question associated with that Bible verse, but you want that student to understand, or to you want to draw out from the student what they understand from that Bible verse or from the note. So you want them to state in their own language, in their own words, what do they understand by whatever the Bible verse was saying. So that's the idea here. That's how we get to know whether our students understand the lesson or not. So you'll, as a teacher, you'll come up with those questions as well. So don't just simply ask the question, read a Bible verse, read a note. That's not teaching the lesson, okay? So what you want to do, though, you want to have a clear objective before you come into class. What is that objective? And that's what I want to run through today. What objective I came up with for this week. So, and these objectives, remember, this objective is based on the 5 micro points I got from the lesson this week, okay? So my objective, so this is all about when Jesus commanded silence. Now, it's interesting because when Jesus called the disciples, he called them to go and preach the gospel to every creature under heaven, to every nation, baptizing them to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And he promised to be with them till the end of the world. So Jesus is commanding us to go and preach, but as we're learning from the key verse of the lesson. It's a key verse is quoting Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 and verse 7, the last part. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. And that's what the lesson is going to bring out through the book of Mark, just some examples here of times when Jesus commanded people to be silent and times when he commanded them to speak, to preach, to share what he had done for them. And that's an interesting thing because sometimes you would think, well, we should just share what Jesus has done for us all the time to everyone, as many as we can, as fast as we can. And that's, what we should be doing. But there's always a time and a place. Okay, so there's the key verses bringing out there's a time to keep silence and time to speak. And that's what we're going to learn about in the lesson this week. So it says here, the Savior never went to extremes. This is important. The Savior never went to extremes, never lost self-control, never violated free speech. Sorry, not free speech. My head's too much in the media this week. Never violated the laws of good taste. He knew when to speak and when to keep silent. And that's important, isn't it? Knowing when to speak and when to keep silent. So my key objective, now I base this objective on the lesson for this week. From the 5 points I got from the lesson this week, my key objective is this. We need to commune with God constantly in order to know when to speak and when to keep silent for him. Okay, so we're called to preach the gospel, but we need to be in communion with God constantly in order to know when to speak the gospel message and when to keep silent, when to refrain from sharing, because it just depends on the situation and circumstances. So, as we'll find in this lesson. So, let's have a look now at some examples here that are looking at the life of Jesus, as Mark revealed. Firstly, our first section is dealing with Jesus when he was casting out demons. And it gives an example here of Jesus commanding the devils or the demons not to speak or publish the fact that he was the Christ or the Messiah. It says here, what command did Jesus give to unclean spirits? Now remember, when Jesus was preaching here, it was a Sabbath day. He was in the synagogue. And you'll remember from lesson 5 that Mark 1:22, the people were astonished at his doctrine because he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes and Pharisees. So they were amazed at his teaching. And so Jesus was there teaching the gospel. Then all of a sudden, a person is possessed of the devil, of demons, interrupts the teaching and, calls Jesus, cries out, and says, it says this, it says, I've got here Mark 1:23-27. There was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God. So here was a man possessed of demons, confessing that Jesus was the Holy One of God. Now, that's not what Jesus was focusing on. He wanted people to focus on who he was. He wanted them to focus on his teaching. And so this was just, I believe, as the note is bringing out here, it was a means of the devil interrupting Jesus' teaching so the people would not understand the things that he spoke and be distracted by this man possessed of demons. You know how that can happen in a meeting. Someone comes and interrupts in a very vocal or violent way, and everyone's mind then is taken away from what the speaker was sharing and taken over to or focus on the incident, whatever is happening there. So that's what it was like here. But so Jesus just commanded them to keep silent, not to share that he was the Christ, and he rebuked them. Again, in Luke 4:41, another example is given here, how Jesus all the devils came out of many crying and saying, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of God." And he rebuked them not to speak, for they knew that he was Christ. He did not want the people to know that he was the Christ. That was not what he wanted to make. He did not want to make that claim. He was simply showing the character of the Christ, the character of God, and he wanted the people to be attracted to his character, not to who he was. So, as the Christ, as the Son of God, he wanted them to be attracted to his character and to his teachings, and so that's important. So, I've got here as a summary point. Sometimes it's more needful to know what Christ taught than who Christ is. It's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes it's more needful for someone to know what Christ taught than who Christ is. So that's my micro point in summary from Sunday. So now looking at another example, coming over to Monday's lesson, we got here a command to some who were healed. Okay, so here we have Jesus now. So in Sunday, he was commanding the devils to keep silent, but this is interesting. And this is kind of foreign to, what we've come to expect from the gospel, especially when we're touched by it in a experimental way. That is when we've really experienced some marvelous blessing in our life, or some healing grace, or some spiritual victory in our life. We want to praise God. Well, there's a time and a place to do that, and we're going to see that in this part of the lesson here. There's some examples are given here. We've got in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 44, there was a leper who had come to Jesus for cleansing. Jesus healed the leper, you remember. Now, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone." He wanted the leper to go to the priests to be declared clean from the priests, and let them certify that he was clean. Now, what the problem here was, Jesus knew the prejudice of the priests and of the Pharisees and scribes. He knew what their prejudices were. He feared that if this man would just proclaim that he was clean, that it would incite prejudice against his work, against his ministry, and because of the miracle he performed, and the priests would deny that the man ever had leprosy or something like that. So what he wanted to do was ensure that this man quietly went to the priest, got certified that he was clean, free of leprosy, and that way Jesus could continue his ministry. Now that man, well, okay, for the first he obeyed for half of it. He went to the priest without saying anything to anybody. They declared him clean, and then he told them who did it, and it was Jesus. And he couldn't help but proclaim the fact that he was healed by Jesus. So sometimes, you just can't help but do that. So that was an example of Jesus healing someone and telling them not to share it with anyone else. Now, I was just checking the Bible verse there. Yep. So the next section here was dealing now with, with Jairus's daughter, which we've touched on Jairus's daughter before, but this is just another lesson from it. Jairus's daughter was healed. She was raised from the dead, and they were astonished. And he charged them that they should tell no one, and commanded that something be given to eat. So they weren't to tell anybody what had happened. Okay. I think again for the same reason as the man with the leprosy, Jesus was focused on a mission here. And in his ministry, he did not want to incite the prejudices of the people against him, though his enemies against him. But he could not help but help and heal people along the way. So the more people that were healed, the more that proclaimed it, the more at risk he was in his work being cut short. So he wanted to complete that work. He wanted his or those that he healed, the people that he healed, he wanted them to remain here. Um, again, at Bethesda, the pool at Bethesda. Remember, at Bethesda, that was a pool where when it was the understanding was that whenever the waters were troubled, the common belief was an angel would come and trouble the waters of this pool. And when the waters were being troubled, everyone who was sick, if they walked down into that water, they would be healed. And there was a multitude of people there, as it says there. They were sick and infirm. It says in the verse here, a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, and withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Now this was the Sabbath day, and remember the Jews, because they had lost sight of Christ as the is the center of their economy. They'd lost sight of a personal relationship with Jesus. They'd lost sight of having a personal relationship with God. The Sabbath lost its significance to them, and they restricted the Sabbath. They bound it up in all kinds of rules and regulations. And one of the regulations was you couldn't carry anything on the Sabbath or whatnot. You couldn't do work on the Sabbath. And Jesus, by healing, they were classed that as work. Well, there was one case that Jesus couldn't resist healing, and that was the impotent man who'd been there with an infirmity for 38 years. And Jesus healed him, told him to rise, take up your bed and walk, but don't tell anyone. All right. That's what Jesus told him. Don't tell anybody. But that man, he couldn't help but tell them who healed him on the Sabbath day. All right. So the problem was he was worried about his work being cut short. Now, just so you know, in my lesson study, I have a system I'm using of hash symbols and asterisks primarily, but I'll run you through that. The asterisk means a new concept, as you can see there. The arrow is a personal help, a need. The plus symbol is a personal help, and the hash symbol is something the class should understand. Now, in my lesson study, I actually use the hash symbol primarily. As you can see, I'm using it here, and that, can you see that? There, and I'm using it again over here. You can see it there, and that is something I want my class to understand. And generally speaking, that's where I'm going to pull my key theme from for that day, the micro point, because I think that's something that's important. I think that summarizes it. But in this case here, I've got under Sunday, let me just see, sorry, in Jesus lesson number 8, and I'm going on to here Monday, that the problem here with healing so many on the Sabbath was that it would excite the prejudice of the Jews against Jesus. And because they still had a lot of influence, the leaders had a lot of influence with the people, and the people respected them still. And Jesus, in healing on the Sabbath, they would not understand, his work and of what the Sabbath was really about. It was a day of rest, a day of spiritual refreshment, a day to do good, a day to heal. So we're Sabbath keepers today. We keep the Sabbath today, but when we say keep the Sabbath, what we mean by is we refrain from secular labor, and we go about doing good on that day. We focus on God. We on our building up our relationship with God, and relieving pain and suffering on that day, the acts of necessity and the relief of suffering. We can do that on that day, and that's what the Sabbath is all about, and that's what Jesus wanted them to understand. But right now, the people were too prejudiced against him, so that's why sometimes he would ask people, "Don't tell anybody, okay? I've healed you, but don't tell anybody about it right now." So again, we see here a third example is given here in Mark 7:31-36, and that is of a man who was deaf and dumb. Jesus opened his ears and loosed his tongue, and the man was able to both hear and speak. And the more Jesus charged him not to speak, the more the man couldn't resist and went forth and proclaimed even more so who it was that healed him. So it was a bit of a point. It was a hopeless task hopeless cause trying to prevent that man from publishing abroad what Jesus had done for him. Gave him hearing, restored. I think it was dumb from birth, blind, deaf, and dumb from birth. So Jesus had given him hearing and speech. So that was an amazing thing. But yeah, just bringing out there why sometimes Jesus commanded them to be silent. It was because of the prejudice it would raise against his mission. So my summary here is sometimes we need to limit what we say and when we say it to further God's work. Okay. Now, this is in contrast to section 3, Tuesday's lesson. All right. So section 3, we have some examples here. Of the demoniacs. The demoniacs, Mark has one. I think in Luke and elsewhere it has two or more. So, in any case, Jesus healed the demoniac. He came to Jesus, possessed, but there was a plea in his heart. I think Jesus could read his heart. There was a plea in his heart for help, even though he was out of control. He was possessed of the devil, and he was torn, cut, naked. I imagine he was unshaven. He was just a sorry sight. The disciples were very afraid of him. He was a madman, a crazed man, but Jesus healed him. And now in his right mind, he stands there before him, just adoring Jesus. And now in this condition, this was in Decapolis, I believe, Jesus told the demoniac to go and tell your friends, go home to your village and tell your friends the great things that God has done for you. And so the demoniac did do that. So you see, there were times when Jesus told people to keep silent, other times he told them to share. And so it just depends on the time and situation and circumstance. We all can tell our story, and this is my summary of Tuesday. We can all tell our story of the power of Christ, His grace in our lives, as God leads us to share that. Sometimes people just don't want to hear it, but other times they're open to hear it. So we need to be in tune, I think, for God to lead and guide us to understand just when those times are. Now, coming over now to section number 4. This section is when some did not keep silent. All right. So coming over here, just examples here. There was when those who Jesus requested to keep silent, looking at some effects, some consequences of not keeping silent, of speaking when Jesus wants us not to speak, what effect it has. This is brought out here under section 4. Okay, so when did some not keep silent? Well, in the case of here, when the man, as I just mentioned here, is it 140? Where is it? Mark, verse 19. Sorry. Yeah, Mark 1:45. Jesus told a man there not to speak, but he went out and he blazed abroad the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city. So this is what happened on this occasion here, when he told this person not to go and publish what Jesus had done for him, because the problem was it was going to impede Jesus' ministry, and that's exactly what happened. That Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but he was without in desert places, and they came to him from every quarter. So it sort of prevented Jesus from he was forced for a time to cease his labors in that city. Why? Because the people flocked to him, and he had no, he was forced to leave that city because he was exhausted, physically exhausted. And again, even there in the wilderness, people would come to see him now. and multitudes would come to see him, and they became quite large to the point where finally Jesus just had to send his disciples away, and he himself went into a mountain to pray. So this is another example here of what can happen when we don't keep silent, when we should be keeping silent. Okay. So yeah, and I just wanted to, I just thought it was interesting too. It was brought out there in that note there about the need for the work, God's work, God's workers to take rest. Okay. Disciples took rest, Jesus took a rest, took a break from ministry. So sometimes you've got to keep silent because the work just forces you to be quiet for a bit. You're speaking so long, so much, so working so hard, you've got to take a break. And John 7 now gives another example here in John chapter 7 of another reason why Jesus did not want his fame to be published abroad, he gives here, is that his time was not fulfilled. You see, what would happen if the more people proclaimed the miracles and the wonderful miracle working power of Jesus and the things he was doing for them, the more it excited the prejudice of the Jewish leaders, and that would compel them to silence Jesus because they were losing their influence they would lose their influence with the people. So they would silence Jesus, and that would basically cut short his ministry. So he basically, said to them, "My time is not come." All right. So he was urged by his brothers to present himself publicly as the Messiah. But he said to them in John 7:6, "My time is not yet come." And so that's another reason. So my summary here is sometimes we can hinder God's work by speaking when we should keep silent. Okay, so that's really important to realize that. So it's important to know when to speak. It's important to now to know also when to keep silent and why we should be keeping silent, because it's going to hinder God's work. Not because we're ashamed, not because we don't have anything to say, but because we don't want to prejudice the minds of people against the greater work that's going to be accomplished or that's being accomplished. So we're just going to know when to speak and when to keep silent, which leads us under section 5, which is when we should be silent. And this brings us to our key verse. The key verse here is Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1, and second half of verse 7. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Okay, so time to keep silence and a time to speak. And it's the wisdom of God that can only help us understand when that should be. I really like what's brought out in the note here, that Christ never erred. I'd be sharing this in my class, and I've got that highlighted, or not highlighted, but I've got an asterisk beside that. Sorry, a hash symbol, because this is some points that I want to bring out here. Firstly, Christ never erred in his judgment of men and of truth. He was never deceived by appearances. He never raised a question, but that was clearly appropriate. He never gave an answer, but what was fitting and right to the point. Christ never went to extremes, never lost self-control or the balance of mind under any excitement. He never violated the law of good taste and discernment, and discernment when to speak and when to keep silent. So it's interesting. It's a law of good taste and discernment. So this is a law of good taste and discernment. When to keep silent and when to speak. That's why we need discernment. We need that spiritual discernment. Only that can come from God. One other time is to keep silent is when it comes to Proverbs. Sorry, is when it comes to questions of our faith. When any put questions that serve only to confuse the mind and sow the seeds of doubt, they should be advised to refrain from such questioning. We must learn when to speak and when to keep silent, learn to sow the seeds of faith, to impart light, not darkness. Okay, so sometimes we can raise questions that raise doubts in people's minds about the truth, about the message of the gospel and of Jesus, of Christ, and we need to be careful that we don't confuse minds and sow seeds of doubt with foolish questions, or questions that aren't going to be edifying to those who are. The Bible talks about that. Paul talks about that to Timothy. Avoid vain and foolish questions. Yes. All right. And question B, another time to keep silent, brings out here, is when it comes to ourselves, not praise ourselves. Let another praise thee and not thine own self. Okay. So that's a concept I'd bring out in class as well. And that's really about self-denial. Is to do good to others, where inclination would lead you to serve and please yourself. That's self-denial. That's what it means. To deny yourself is to do good to others, where inclination would lead you to serve and please yourself, where you might even praise yourself and instead of doing that, self-denial means to keep silent and let other lips praise you. All right. And Jesus exemplified that in his own life. Some wonderful Bible verses there, John 8, verse 50 and John 7, verse 18. All right. Jesus said of himself, I seek not mine own glory, but there is one that seeketh and judgeth. In verse 18 of chapter 7. And John, he that speaketh of himself seeketh his own glory, but he that seeketh his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. So Jesus did not glorify himself, did not, proclaim who he was. He let other people declare who he was, because that was God moving them to do that. He did not declare himself who he was. He either read from the scriptures or he spoke the truths of God's word and let people discern who he was by his character and his teaching. So that's an example of Jesus when it comes to himself. He kept silent, wasn't praising himself. All right. So there you go. So my last point there, we have a duty to speak for Christ rather than ourselves at the right time and place. So summarizing those points, or just running through those points again. Okay, so that's the lesson for this week. So let's have a look here. Point number one, micro point one, sometimes it's more needful to know what Christ taught than who Christ is. Okay, sometimes it's more needful for people to know what Christ taught. And that means to teach people what Christ taught rather than who Christ is. Sometimes second point, sometimes we need to limit what we say and when we say it to further God's work. So think about it. We can further God's work by limiting what we say and when we say it. We don't have to spill all the beans at once. We can limit what we say and where we say it and who we say it to. Section 3, we all can tell our story of the power of Christ's grace in our lives as God leads us. And that's why it's important to have the leading of God in our life, to have that communion with God, for him to lead us. And as we trust in the Lord with all our heart, as Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6 says, lean not on our own understanding, and he'll let him direct us. Section 4 is sometimes we can hinder God's work by speaking when we should keep silent. All right. So we want to further God's work. We don't want to hinder it. And that leads us to, we have a duty to speak for Christ. Section number 5, we have a duty to speak for Christ rather than ourselves at the right time and place. Okay, so we have a duty to speak, and we should go out there and speak at the right time and place as God directs and guides us. So that's where I've summarized the lesson, taken those 5 micro points back into my macro. We need to commune with God constantly in order to know when to speak and when to keep silent for him. Okay, there you have it. So I hope that's been a help for you, and God bless you wherever you are in the Sabbath School this week. I trust you gain a blessing. Remember, the number one objective of Sabbath School is what? If you've been to my Sabbath School seminars, number one objective, number one lesson for everybody to learn, the most important lesson is what it means. Is the experimental knowledge of what it means to be born again, the lesson Christ taught the Nicodemus. Remember that. That's the number one lesson for everyone to learn. So that's the number one thing you should be focusing on as your teacher in your class. And secondly, go into your class with a clear objective and teach to the objective. I trust that these thoughts tonight or today on this video have given you some idea of how you can teach your class or guide your class to an understanding of the lesson for this week. So there you have it, the command to keep, when Jesus commanded silence. I trust you've gained a blessing, And until next time, take care. God bless. Be prayerful. Be careful. Take the Lord with you and have a wonderful Sabbath day. Till next week, God bless you. Bye for now.